When a man named David returned to his childhood hometown after years away, he expected quiet mornings, familiar soil, and the comfort of his late father's ranch. Instead, he found a bright red notice taped to the front door, ordering him to tear the ranch down within 24 hours. No explanation, no courtesy. Only the cold stamp of the HOA and a scribbled message telling him to follow community standards. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering with narrowed eyes. Something wasn't right, and the hostility around him had nothing to do with buildings. Viewers should watch until the end. Wait a second. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories just like this one. David had spent more than a decade serving overseas and working far from the southern town where he was raised. After his father passed, the ranch stood empty, quietly waiting among acres of pine trees. It was more than property. It was his father's legacy, a piece of land purchased during a time when families like his weren't welcome to own much at all. Returning to restore it felt like reclaiming his roots. But the town had changed while he was gone. New housing developments had sprung up, modern homes built on leased land that once belonged entirely to his family. With them came a strict, self-important HOA, one that valued image far more than community. When David stepped into the local store, the clerk stared a moment too long. When he drove past neighbors, some turned their faces away. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He was being watched. The tension around him skyrocketed. Early one morning, a white SUV pulled up outside the ranch. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard and measuring tape. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile. He studied the ranch as if it were a contagion infecting the neighborhood. After scribbling aggressively into his papers, he drove off without a word. By noon, 3 more cars had slowed to take pictures of the property. Later that day, David found the first official violation notice lying on the porch. The HOA claimed the ranch violated visual compliance standards and demanded it be removed. The accusation made no sense. The ranch had stood there long before their glossy brochure houses existed. But what followed made the intent clear: a sudden wave of new rules, seemingly written just for him. His truck was labeled non-compliant. His tools, kept inside the shed, were called unauthorized equipment. Even the wooden fence installed by his father was deemed unsafe and unattractive. He tried attending the next HOA meeting, hoping for a conversation. Instead, he was met with cold stares and curt voices insisting the ranch was out of place and unpleasant to community standards. The tone they used wasn't about aesthetics, it was about belonging. Their words carried a quiet accusation, a suggestion that someone like him didn't fit the image they wanted for their neighborhood. At the grocery store, the clerk pretended not to see him. At the hardware store, the owner locked the door the moment he parked. Neighbors whispered as he passed, some shaking their heads. The hostility thickened each day until the message became painfully clear. The HOA didn't want to remove a building, they wanted to remove him. But they didn't know the land they stood on wasn't theirs to control. The breaking point came during an emergency HOA meeting held to address the problematic structure. David arrived to find the board seated at the front, papers stacked high, photos spread across the table showing his ranch from every angle. Their president stood with forced authority, announcing they had full legal right to fine him daily. Until the ranch was gone, several residents nodded eagerly, confident in their power. Then the room shifted. David calmly placed a thick file on the table, land deeds, lease contracts, and legal documents his father had created decades earlier. The truth struck the room like a shockwave. The HOA didn't own half the land under their own neighborhood, they rented it. And the lease renewal date was now in David's hands. Faces drained of color. Arrogance evaporated. Silence filled the room. Within days, the HOA stopped mentioning demolition notices. Instead, they received formal letters informing them that the rent for the land beneath their homes would increase tenfold. Their board scrambled, desperate to negotiate, but David refused to entertain apologies born from panic. He didn't want revenge, he wanted accountability. Word of the HOA's actions spread. Neighbors who never questioned their leaders before began to see the truth. The targeting, the intimidation, the discrimination, disguised as policy. Some apologized quietly, ashamed. Others hid behind curtains just as before. But a few stood, beside David, recognizing that silence had allowed injustice to thrive for years. The ranch still stands, restored, strong, and rooted in history. And the town now carries a lesson. When discrimination tries to push someone out, it may find itself standing on ground it never really owned. Where are you watching from? What country and city? Smoothly continuing the same tone and third-person perspective. When David first drove into town, he noticed the changes instantly. The old bakery was gone, replaced by a polished cafe with patio seating and spotless umbrellas. Familiar faces were missing, replaced by newcomers who carried themselves like the town was built for them alone. Still, he tried to believe he could fit back into the life his father had always dreamed for him. The ranch needed repairs, but nothing he couldn't handle. He patched roofs, reinforced beams, sanded the old porch, and restored the barn doors with steady hands. Every sunrise felt like a promise, until the SUV arrived. At first, David tried to give the neighborhood the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't recognize him. Perhaps the curiosity was harmless, but then came the stares, long, assessing, uncomfortable. A woman walking her dog crossed to the opposite sidewalk whenever David appeared. Children stopped playing the moment he passed, watching him as if he were a stranger trespassing. The HOA didn't send friendly reminders. They sent warnings, harsh, accusatory, and unprovoked, and they escalated fast. One notice claimed his home violated aesthetic harmony. Another accused him of creating environmental imbalance. A third warned that his restoration work was disruptive. Each notice felt less like a rule and more like a threat. One night, David discovered tire tracks cutting deep into the soil near his fence. The marks didn't match his vehicle. Someone had driven directly onto his land. A plank from the wall lay broken, snapped clean across the middle. He reported it to the police. The responding officer barely wrote a sentence before shrugging it off. Probably kids, the officer said, but the tracks were too large, and kids didn't drive SUVs. That same week, the hardware store owner refused to sell him nails. "We're out," he claimed, despite shelves full behind him. The message was the same everywhere. "You don't belong." Rather than react with anger, David turned to the documents his father left behind. His father had always warned him, know the land. Know the papers, they matter more than people think. And he had been right. David spent nights combing through boxes of deeds, surveys, and agreements. That's when he discovered the truth. His father had leased a significant portion of the surrounding land to the county decades earlier. The HOA had built homes on land they didn't own, and those leases had expiration dates. David checked twice. Then 3 times, everything matched. When the emergency meeting notice arrived, David already expected a confrontation, but even he didn't anticipate the hostility inside the room. The HOA president spoke with confidence that bordered on arrogance. He waved photos like evidence in a courtroom, claiming the ranch was offensive to the neighborhood's standards. The residents murmured, some agreeing eagerly. They never imagined David had any power. And that arrogance, the belief that they could push him out simply because he wasn't what they wanted in their neatly curated neighborhood, was precisely what blinded them. As David laid out the documents, the room fell silent. Lease maps, signatures, county filings, renewals, dates. Every page confirmed the same devastating truth. The HOA's most influential members lived on land rented from David's family, the president's home, the vice president's, even 3 board members who had signed violation notices, and they had never bothered to check ownership. One board member whispered, "This can't be right." But it was. Reality hit hard. The ranch they tried so desperately to erase was rooted deeper in the town's history than any of their modern homes. Over the next week, the community felt the impact. Letters were delivered to every household leasing family property. The rent increase was significant enough to panic board members. They begged for a meeting. They wanted to discuss terms. They insisted it was all a misunderstanding. But David stood firm. The HOA's treatment wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination hiding behind paperwork. Their rules were never about paint colors or fence height. They were about to push out a man whose presence challenged their curated image. And now they had to face what they had tried so hard to ignore. When the truth spread, residents began asking questions. Some realized how easily they had accepted the HOA's word without considering the bias behind it. A few came to the ranch, quietly apologizing for not recognizing the injustice sooner. Others retreated in shame, unable to face the man they had judged. But the most meaningful change came from those who took a stand, neighbors who spoke against the HOA, demanded accountability, and supported the man who had been wronged. The story,